so long as we leave love unexamined, so long as we don't look candidly at the failures and dangers of love as we experience it, that's why I say that we're summoned to love the unlovable in ourselves, which includes our own failures in love. We think that love is essentially a matter of strong individual attachment, and that very easily turns into something which is a source of strong affirmation for myself and goes alongside strong aversion for the other. And in both of the spiritual traditions that I value, well, I value lots, but particularly I think my own Christian tradition, but what I've also learned from Buddhism, there's a sort of skepticism here about living your life on this pendulum between strong attachment and strong aversion. And there's something else, I think, going on that we have to live our way into, which is called love, mostly because it's not destructive, it's not cannibalizing of the other. And I found a useful text for that when recently on an aeroplane I was watching Greta Gerwig's film Lady Bird, which some of you I think will have seen. And the elderly nun at one point in that film points out to young Lady Bird, Christine, that the way she writes about Sacramento, this town which she says she hates, suggests that she loves it because she's paying attention. She's paying intense attention to the particularity of it. And says, well, maybe that's love. Now, to take another French writer, I mean, Lacan's remarks are very pertinent, but going back a bit further, Simone Weil, one of the great mid-century French philosophers, speaks very eloquently in terms of how attention is what we constantly have to learn, because attention is what takes us away from the focus on the strength of our feeling and into the sheer density, the sheer there-ness of the other. It's self-forgetful, not self-obliterating, but if I'm utterly preoccupied with attending, and that's what happens when a musician performs, what happens in personal love, what happens in a number of other contexts, my ego and its agenda is, for that moment, parked. I'm taken up with something that's not simply confined by my wants, the intensity of my feelings, and the result is, ideally, we grow together, myself and the object of the attention. So I think that's where I'd want to start in talking about a love that isn't just about intense subjectivity, which isn't just about oceans of positive feeling washing around, and which certainly is very skeptical about all those, or let's say very aware of all those risks which Renata's just spoken of in terms of making the other perform my script in one way or another.
So the conceptual points I want to raise about romantic love can be nicely illustrated by one of the speeches in Plato's dialogue on Eros, the symposium. Now, Eros, of course, is erotic love, but the speech of Aristophanes, the comic poet, describes something very, very close to our late 18th, early 19th century conception of romantic love. So he gives us a fable in which originally there were proto-humans who were entirely spherical, with two faces on one head, two sets of arms, two sets of legs, two sets of genitalia. And they sort of bounded around the earth like acrobats, and they didn't have sex as we know it, they kind of conceived upon the ground like crickets. But they got too big for their many boots, and they threatened the gods, and Zeus and the other gods wanted to cut them down to size, but didn't want to annihilate them completely because they liked all the libations and the sacrifices and the general worship. So they cut them in half, physically cut them in half. And then you get this notion that each person is going, I say person in inverted commas, because as we'll see, it's not clear they are people, is going around the world literally searching for their other half. And Aristophanes says we don't care whether this other half is good or bad, beautiful or ugly. It is the fact that they are ours. They are part of us. And because originally there had been three sexes, male, female, and hermaphrodite, and the circular beings, that accounts for heterosexuality and male and female homosexuality. Now, this raises some really interesting philosophical questions. One, if it happens that one of these halves meets another half, they yearn to be reunited. They actually want the blacksmith god Hephaestus to reunite them into one body with his blacksmith's tools. And this raises a really problematic ethical issue and also a metaphysical one. The ethical issue is that, yes, this story captures the fact that we see the other as unique. There is only one other half for us, and irreplaceable, a particular unique, irreplaceable. But do we see them as an individual in their own right, or simply as our missing half, the missing bit of us, which we want to reabsorb into us? Just as, of course, the other person wants to reabsorb us into them. And that raises both troubling ethical issues and, of course, also metaphysical ones. The final point is that Aristophanes defines this kind of romantic erotic love in terms of a quest. He says it is the desire for and pursuit of the whole. So it's defined in terms of a quest, a pursuit. And that gives rise to the possibility that if this desire is consummated, if they actually were to be reunited by the blacksmith god into a whole, then you cancel out the conditions that make erotic and romantic love possible. So the idea that Plato explores and plays around with here is that actually romantic and indeed erotic, but in this case romantic love, is always in a state of quest. It's always looking towards a boundary that it can never quite reach because we can't physically be reunited. But even if we could reach that boundary, would we want to? Because erotic love and a romantic love is working towards its own annihilation if fully consummated. So the idea that there needs to be this separation, this distance, this lack of complete consummation to keep erotic and a romantic love going.
Thanks, Michael. Well, I'd like to pick up actually on what Rowan's just said about attention. It reminds me of a series of experiments that this, I suppose, quite controversial Japanese man called Matsuo Emoto did in Japan. There's one particular experiment where he's looking at the effects of human behavior, and this sounds absolutely mad, but anyway, he's looking at the effects of human behavior on rice. So he has this experiment where in his hallway he has 3 jars of rice. It's the same rice from the same packet emptied into 3 different containers. And on one, when he leaves the house each morning and comes back, to the first one he says, "I love you." To the second one he says, "I hate you." And the third one he ignores completely. And and over time he maps the effect of this, and the first jar to begin to decay, the rice that begins to deteriorate, is the one that's paid no attention at all. Which suggests to me actually that perhaps, we think of love and hate as being opposites. Perhaps actually the true opposite of love is indifference. It's not giving any attention, to use your word, at all. And for me, actually, that's one of the many ways in which probably love and hate are more intimately connected than we might think they are. For a start, I don't really believe that hatred is a primary emotion in a way that love is. In other words, I think that hate arises as a reaction to something. And I say that just not as a matter of principle, but I'm also thinking of psychoanalysts. You talked about post-Freudians. I was thinking about Melanie Klein as you were talking. She does use the word hate, actually, in relation to young babies. And she says they will, even quite young babies, experience feelings of hatred towards their mothers when they're not picked up or fed or held. But it's not a primary emotion, it's a reaction to the interruption of the loving bond in some way. So although we might think almost statically that, love is here and hatred is there, that they're in some sort of spatial relationship, you can almost think of them as in a temporal relationship. Love comes first, and then hatred is a kind of reaction to it, a sort of revenge on aborted love, or a disappointment at love not getting off the ground, or something like that. So hatred has a sort of, almost has a mourning for the impossibility of love kind of contained within it, as if we most spontaneously or most primarily would seek a love position. Having said that, I think to be pure, and I'm not suggesting it's possible, but to be pure, love would have to hate the hateable as well, because if you only love what's lovable, if you love what's lovable in your partner, well, that's easy. There's no challenge in loving what's lovable. Presumably, it's only when you are confronted with what's hateable or extremely hard to love that the gesture of love becomes authentic in some way. So, in philosophical terms, this would be the idea of including the other. The radical otherness of the other person is such that I hate them. But even in the midst of my hating them, I then learn to love them because their otherness is something which I can then begin to come to terms with. So it's an otherness that allows the other person, in all their horribleness, to remain other.
Well, love certainly doesn't depend on brain chemicals. Well, brain chemicals involved in every neural process, the neurotransmitters. But if you look at, say, the love that dogs can have for humans, they undoubtedly love humans, and as some people say, when you get a dog, it's the only kind of love that money can buy. And there are better examples of unconditional love than most humans. Only the highest level of saints can achieve the level of unconditional love that many dogs show for their unworthy owners. And certainly they're not, they may be additives in pet food that that we don't know about, but it's certainly not just drug. It's about relationship and about something to do with relationship going beyond pure, immediate, personal self-interest. It's about commitment and relationship to another person, another organism. And so I think that coming back to the transcendent aspect, I think the mystical aspect, the transcendent aspect of some psychedelics is to open people up to this much greater sense of love which can exist in mystical experiences and which often has a healing effect. For example, mushrooms, psilocybin, and other psychedelics are now being used to treat, as many people know, depression and addictions. And they're working not just because the chemical is affecting chemicals in the brain, they're working because they induce experiences of connection that transcend our normal, everyday, mundane lives and give people a sense that they're part of something much greater than themselves, and there's a kind of loving presence in the universe which can change their lives in a way that makes them more loving people. So there are effects of drugs that can be transformative, but most of the time, love depends on just regular neurochemicals and a bonding, a connection which takes people beyond their own limited selves, as you were saying. It's to do with relationship.